Hello friend, thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today let's spend some time with The Third Reich at War by Richard J. Evans. This book was originally published back in 2008, and it's the third volume of A History of the Third Reich by Richard J. Evans, and I have read the previous two volumes and chatted them here on my channel. The first one's called The Coming of the Third Reich, and then the second one is called The Third Reich in Power. But this one, The Third Reich at War, picks up where Book 2 left off, which is the occupation of Poland after the invasion of September 1st, 1939. And this volume takes us all the way to the collapse of the Third Reich in May of 1945 and ends there. It does not discuss post-war Germany at all. So, Third Reich at War by Richard J. Evans. You know, I wanted to read this history really because I'm really interested in how this sort of ideology can overtake a country and then have implications actually ultimately to the entire world, where this ideology can impact individuals, it can impact organizations and ultimately countries, and then have this devastating impact on the world, which is what happened here during World War II. But how I thought I would approach this is to discuss a little bit about how there's 7 chapters in the book, and go over what each is covered in each of the chapters, just so that there's an idea of what all is contained in the book. Subject matter wise, I'm not qualified to teach this, so what I'll do is I'll pull out some just facts, sort of thoughts and themes that I've had when reading the book. But what I want to start out by saying is what this book is not. This is not a history of World War II. And it's not a Holocaust history. It is particularly a history of the regime itself, the Third Reich, and its impact that it had within Germany and within the areas that it came into contact through occupation, etc. So, chapter 1 picks up where Book 2 left off, which is the occupation of Poland and really the violence and exploitation of the tens of thousands of Poles and Polish Jews especially that happened following that occupation. And I'm going to talk more about that here in a bit. Chapter 2, the conquest, is about the conquest of Western Europe through the start of the Russian campaign then in the East in 1941. Chapter 3 is the launching and implementation of the so-called final solution, the genocide of the Jews. And chapter 4 looks at the war economy, including the forced labor that the Third Reich required. Chapter 5 follows the defeat at Stalingrad, which really was a turning point in the war, and this chapter really focuses then on the defeat of Rommel's army in North Africa and the collapse of the Italian fascist state led by Mussolini. Chapter 6 is devoted to the home front and how religious, social, cultural, and scientific life interacted with the war and the emergence of resistance to the ideology within Germany itself. Chapter 7, the last chapter, talks about the development of these so-called wonder weapons, which were in development, such as rocket technology, that were supposedly going to reverse the military decline that Germany was experiencing late in the war. But then this chapter goes ultimately then to the complete collapse of the Third Reich and the surrender then. So, key thoughts on reading this book. You know, the first sort of takeaway that I have right away with the occupation of Poland was the difference of the plan in the East, so Poland and the occupied areas of the East, versus that of the West, like France and Netherlands and the Western occupied countries were treated differently. And the reason for this really was around the National Socialist ideology of Slavic peoples being less human, a type of subhuman. And so they thought the goal was to have this greater Reich in the East, which the plan was to displace the current population of Poland and other parts of the Slavic East and replace them with Germans. So it didn't matter to the Third Reich how the population of Poland and these occupied areas, Slavic areas, were treated, because ultimately they had no future. they sort of equated this to how the English had conquered the continent of America and also Australia, which was coming in and displacing a so-called inferior people with a superior one. So this is sort of how they looked at it. They did not view the same Western Europeans as the same because they thought they were, while they might, some of them were Germanic, considered fully Germanic, others not, but nevertheless compatible with Germanic people. And so they weren't treated as brutally as those in the East. But overarching of this racial supremacy was this other sort of idea of just like evolutionary supremacy. So this is why the psychologically ill and the handicapped people were also considered expendable, not just expendable, but was necessary to dispose of, meaning kill them, because they were not productive to the future of the Third Reich in their view. There's a quote here that really sort of illustrates this racial supremacy. This was when Bohemia and Moravia were being occupied, and so they were considered kind of a mixed area, right? Some of them racially okay and some not. So I have a quote here that explains the Third Reich's policy. It says, Heydrich lost no time in announcing that the Czechs would be divided into three basic categories. The racially and ideologically unsound would be deported to the east, ultimately to be killed. Those judged racially unsatisfactory but ideologically acceptable would be sterilized. And racially impeccable but ideologically dubious Czechs would be Germanized. If they refused, they would be shot. So, defining these people racially of who is more Germanish, could be Germanized versus who was so racially impure they just needed to be killed. So another sort of key thought that I took away from this was how strange that this ideology was for the Jews, as far as the Jewish people were considered to have caused World War I and World War II. So somehow they were blamed for the actual war, which, Hitler started by invading Poland, among other things. But nevertheless, the Jews were considered to be at fault for the war. And so therefore, they were considered blamed for it, and that they needed to be exterminated so that what happened in World War I and what was happening in World War II would never happen again, because it was their fault, right? And so this message was purposely sent out to the officials of the Reich, and the military and civilian officials of the Reich, that this needed to be done as brutally as possible. There was no room for any pity or sentimentality, that they had to be destroyed, and it was the duty of every German to do this. And that brutality, to me, was I don't know, it was more than, I think a lot of times today we get our history from movies, and movies cannot show the reality of what this was. In this book, we get excerpts from letters from the Germans, the military officers and the military soldiers themselves, of what they had done and what they had seen that they wrote home. We have eyewitness accounts, and it's just brutal, and it could not be shown on film. If people saw what actually happened, they would probably have to go see a psychiatrist. There was a difference in the way, this is brought out in the book, where in the West, like in the United States and in UK, our popular music of the war years is usually around, this will all be over someday, and we're going to get together, and we're going to, we'll meet each other again someday. But there's a song that was written by a Jewish inmate of Theresienstadt. Her name was Ilsa Weber. And the quote here from the song says, "Farewell, it's the end. I'll miss you, my friend, and the hours we spent together. I gave you my heart, stay strong when we part, for this time our farewell's forever." So that's quite different than "There'll Be Bluebirds Over the White Cliffs of Dover," which is the kind of optimistic songs we had in the U.S. and the U.K. during the war. There was a military officer named Wilhelm Hosenfeld. He was in Poland, and he was sympathetic to the Jews. You know, the Jewish people had some sympathy, some sympathizers. Not enough, not nearly enough at all. But this particular officer is the officer that's depicted in the movie The Pianist, if you've ever seen that movie, which I can recommend. And he had a quote here that he wrote home to his wife. He says, "With this terrible murder of the Jews," wrote Wilhelm Hosenfeld on 16 June 1943, "we have lost the war. We have brought upon ourselves an indelible disgrace, a curse that can never be lifted. We deserve no mercy. We are all guilty." You know, reading this book, it just made me want to wonder why everyone's guilty, right? The United States turned away boats of refugees from Europe at the time, sent back to Europe to their deaths. And, you know, looking back on history, I just wish that there had been armadas sent to Poland and Germany and all the occupied countries to get these people that were going to be sent to their death and take them somewhere safe. We had plenty of room in the United States to have brought them here. We could have done that, and we didn't. And I think that's horrible. So other kind of things that jumped out at me were there was a forced labor. This was on a scale I had never really understood until reading this book. But the forced labors, particularly around at the end of the war when they were trying to build these Wonder rockets, the V2 rocket, it was sort of weird, I think, that the V2 rocket cost thousands and thousands and thousands of lives because they were considered expendable to create this, to work in these factories to create these weapons. Mostly Slavic people, Soviet prisoners, and they just were disregarded their health completely. And more people died ultimately manufacturing the V2 rockets than died when they were shot into cities in Belgium and England. I just think that is so tragic. Not that more people died making them than more people in the city should have died, but just that the fact that such a waste and so not needed and so wasteful of civilization there. So speaking of that, just the disregard of civilians here by both the Germans, especially in the East, but also everywhere that they occupied, but also by the Allies with these firebombings of these cities that were just purposefully inflamed. So they would drop bombs and they would drop incendiary devices into that, so to create this more blazing inferno. And the bombing of Hamburg and Dresden, just on a scale that's just hard to imagine today. Finally, final thought. A lot of times I will add quotes from the books or whatever, but this time, I just wanted to add my own quote here at the end of this chat, just because this book makes me want to cry. It was difficult to read in lots of places. I was telling my friend, I was only on like 1940 or 1941, and I was like, I have 4 more years to go. It's just a lot. It's a lot there, and there was just a horrible scale of violence that I hope we never see again in the world. But I had this quote in the chat on. It says, "If your belief system, political, religious, or whatever, is pressuring you or requiring you to see anyone else's humanity as anything less than fully equal to your own, then it's doing humaning wrong, and it's time to find a new belief system." And I hope everybody listens to this. I think even we small scale, if we have a political view we don't agree with, or those who hold political views we don't agree with, we tend to dismiss them, and we tend to sometimes want to see them suffer, and that can lead to what happened here in World War II, and that is not what we want to see again in the world ever. So I will leave the chat there. My next chat is going to be some W. Somerset, Maugham, the Moon, and Sixpence. I have already finished this, and I will have a chat on it coming up soon. Until next time, take care.